When I told my daughter I was thinking about marrying a woman from the Philippines, she didn't yell. I almost wish she had. Instead, she went quiet on the other end of the phone. That particular kind of quiet that Stephanie has used since she was 12 years old, whenever she's choosing her next words very carefully. Then she said, "Dad, I need you to really think about this." She'd already been thinking about it for weeks, it turned out. She'd printed off articles. She'd joined an online forum for families of men who'd been defrauded in international romance scams. She told me she'd even called a non-emergency RCMP line to ask about the statistics. My daughter is thorough. She gets that from her mother. I understood why she was worried. From the outside, the whole thing must have looked exactly like every story she'd been reading. Older widower, small town in Manitoba, meets a younger woman online from halfway around the world. The story practically writes itself, and in most versions of it, the ending is not a happy one. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because before any of that happened, there was just a Tuesday evening in February, a cup of reheated coffee, and a question I almost didn't answer. My wife, Carol, passed away 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to funeral, that's how fast it moved. We'd been married 36 years. She used to say she married me because I was the only man she'd ever met who could back a grain trailer into a tight spot on the first try. And I told her that was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to me. She laughed every time, even at the end when laughing hurt. After the funeral, after the casserole stopped coming, and the neighbors went back to their own lives, I settled into something that looked like routine. I kept the farm going, just cash crops, nothing fancy. About a quarter section I still work myself with some help from a neighbor's boy during seeding and harvest. I drove into Portage la Prairie every second Saturday for groceries. I watched hockey. I went to bed at 10 and lay there staring at the ceiling for an hour before sleep finally came. There wasn't anything particularly wrong with my life. It was just very, very quiet. That February, I'd been looking into the possibility of spending part of the winter somewhere warmer. Nothing wild. I'd heard from a man at church that the Philippines was affordable for retirees, more welcoming than some places, and the flight from Winnipeg wasn't as complicated as I'd expected. I found a Facebook group, something about Canadian expats and retirement in Southeast Asia, and started reading through old posts. One post was from a woman asking about the best neighborhood in Cebu City for someone wanting to stay close to good hospitals. The answers were all over the place, half of them obviously outdated. Then someone replied with a response that was different. Specific, practical, calm. She listed 3 neighborhoods, explained the trade-offs for each, mentioned which had the best access to public transportation, and noted which private hospitals she'd personally worked with and thought well of. I replied to thank her. I asked a follow-up question about visa costs. She answered. That should have been it. Instead, we kept talking. Her name was Glenda. She was a registered nurse at a private hospital in Mandaue, just north of Cebu City. She was 48 years old, had never been married, lived with her mother and a younger sister who was finishing her accounting degree. She was sharp and funny in a dry way that reminded me a little of Carol. She asked good questions and didn't fill silences with nonsense. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be clear about that. The thought of pursuing any kind of relationship had seemed so far away from my life that it was barely worth imagining. But conversations with Glenda became the thing I looked forward to most in a day that had very few things to look forward to. We talked about ordinary things. I told her about the peculiarities of farming in Manitoba, the brutal springs, the way a late frost could wreck you, the strange beauty of a perfectly flat horizon at sunrise. She told me about working night shifts, about the particular challenge of staying calm when a ward is short-staffed, about the way Cebuanos celebrate everything. Baptisms, birthdays, holidays, with more food than anyone could possibly eat. She sent me a photo once of the table, her family had set for her mother's birthday. I told her I hadn't seen that much food outside of a church potluck. She laughed. I could hear it, even through text. Weeks became months. I started taking screenshots of things I'd read that I thought she'd find interesting. A news article, a wildlife photograph, something funny from the farm. I noticed I was doing it without thinking. If a coyote crossed the field at dusk, and the light caught it just right, my first thought was that I should get a photo for Glenda. I couldn't have explained exactly when it changed from friendly conversation to something else. There wasn't a single moment. It was more like the winter ending, gradual, then suddenly obvious. For almost 9 months, we existed inside our phones. Video calls on Sunday mornings, which meant Sunday evenings for her. Voice messages during the week. Long rambling texts about nothing in particular. The question I didn't want to say out loud was whether any of it would survive meeting in person. It's one thing to talk to someone for hours when there's a screen between you. It's another to sit across from them at a table in a city you don't know and find out whether the connection you thought you had was real, or whether you'd both just been very good at filling in the blanks. Glenda was the one who finally named it. Not with any pressure, not with an ultimatum. She just said, one evening, that she hoped one day I'd make it out to Cebu, that she thought I'd enjoy it, and that even if I never did, she was glad we'd ended up talking. She wasn't asking me for a commitment. She was just being honest about where things stood. I opened the Air Canada website that night. Winnipeg to Manila, connecting flight to Cebu. I looked at the prices, closed the browser, and didn't touch it again for 3 days. Then I told Stephanie. My daughter lives in Winnipeg with her husband, works as a project manager for a construction firm. She's organized, careful, not easily rattled. She was the one who handled most of the paperwork after her mother died, because she knew I wasn't in any state to do it myself. I trust her judgment more than almost anyone's, which is probably why her reaction hit me harder than a stranger's would have. She didn't do it all at once. The first call was careful. She asked a lot of questions, listened to my answers, and said she'd think about it. The second call, a week later, was different. She told me she'd been doing research. She mentioned specific numbers. The RCMP's fraud statistics on romance scams targeting widowed Canadians over 60, the average financial loss per victim, the psychological tactics that were most commonly used. She sent me 3 articles and a link to a podcast episode. She wasn't being cruel. She was being Stephanie, which meant she had built a file. I read everything she sent. I listened to the podcast on a drive into town. Some of it scared me. I won't pretend otherwise. I'm not a naive man, but I'd never thought carefully about how sophisticated some of these situations could be. People who study loneliness and exploit it are not amateurs. I started replaying my conversations with Glenda. Had she ever asked me for money? No. Had she ever suggested there was a family crisis she needed help with? No. Had she pushed toward any kind of commitment on a timeline that felt rushed? No. In fact, if anything, she'd been the one to slow things down. She'd been the one to say, more than once, that she didn't want to get ahead of things. But I couldn't stop the questions once they started. That's the thing about doubt. Once it finds a way in, it doesn't need much room to grow. For 2 weeks, I carried it around without saying anything to Glenda. I told myself I was being careful. Really, I think I was just afraid of what would happen when I brought it up. One evening, after we'd been on a video call for almost an hour, talking about nothing in particular, she'd had a long shift. I'd spent most of the day dealing with a broken auger. I took a breath and told her there was something I needed to say. She said okay, just that, she waited. I told her about Stephanie's concerns, about the research my daughter had done, the articles, the statistics. I told her some of it had gotten into my head more than I wanted to admit. I told her I wasn't sure what I was afraid of. Exactly, just that I was. The longer I talked, the worse I felt, not because I thought I was wrong to say it, because I realized what it must sound like from her side, that I was sitting in my kitchen in Manitoba, telling a woman I'd talked to every day for 9 months that people believed she might be deceiving me, not because of anything she'd done, but because of where she was born and what she looked like. When I finished, there was a pause. She asked me one question: did I believe it? I said I didn't think I did, but I'd be lying if I said none of it had gotten through. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think I would feel the same way if it were my father." I didn't know what to say to that. She kept going. She told me she understood why Stephanie was worried, that if someone in her own family was in a similar situation, she'd probably be doing exactly the same research. She wasn't defensive about it. She wasn't upset. She just said quietly, "I can't prove who I am with an article or a statistic. You'll either see it over time or you won't. But don't let someone else decide for you before you've had the chance to find out." That was it. No ultimatum, no demand that I choose, just a calm, reasonable request to be judged by what she actually did. I bought the plane ticket 3 days later. I landed in Mactan Cebu International Airport on a Thursday morning in late November. The heat hit me the moment I stepped outside. Nothing like Manitoba in November. Nothing like anything I'd experienced in my 63 years. Thick, wet heat, like breathing through a warm cloth. Glenda was waiting outside the terminal. She looked exactly like herself. That sounds like a strange thing to say, but after 9 months of video calls, I wasn't entirely sure what to expect. Sometimes a person looks different in 3 dimensions. She didn't. She smiled, I smiled, and we both stood there for a second, like we couldn't quite believe the other one was real. She said, "You look more tired than you do on video." I told her I'd been on planes for 22 hours. She took my carry-on bag without asking, and we started walking. The nervousness I'd been carrying for weeks didn't last long. Within an hour, it felt like we'd simply continued a conversation we'd started 9 months earlier, just without the phone between us. She showed me around Mandaue that first afternoon, the market where she buys vegetables on Sunday mornings, the little bakery near her hospital that makes pain de sal she'd mentioned a dozen times in messages. Everything she described, I'd been picturing in 2 dimensions. Being there made it 3. Over the next several days, I paid attention. I want to be honest about that. I was watching, the way you do when you're still not entirely sure what you're going to find. I watched how she spoke to people at the carbon market, how she was with her mother, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Lourdes, who greeted me with a handshake and immediately handed me a cup of something sweet and hot that I later learned was salabat, how Glenda translated for me patiently, without making me feel like a burden. One afternoon we stopped at a small carinderia near the waterfront, plastic chairs, a ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, a chalkboard menu I couldn't read. While we were waiting for our food, an elderly man came through the door, struggling with a crate of bottled water. Before I'd even processed what was happening, Glenda was on her feet. She took one end of the crate, helped him carry it to a table in the corner, and was back in her seat before our food arrived. She didn't mention it. She picked up the conversation exactly where we'd left it. I remembered it for the rest of the trip. You can rehearse a lot of things. You can't rehearse that. The hardest part of that first visit wasn't the unfamiliar food or the traffic in Cebu City, or the fact that every conversation around me was in Cebuano and I understood none of it. The hardest part was the morning I left. We said goodbye at the departure's drop-off. We hugged. I told her I'd be back. She said she knew, in a way that meant she believed it. I didn't look back until I was through the first set of doors. When I did, she was still standing there, one hand raised. I kept walking. On the flight home, 6 hours to Manila, 2-hour layover, then 8 hours to Toronto, then a connection to Winnipeg, I had plenty of time to think. I'd expected to feel relieved once I was back in a familiar context. I didn't. Everything about it felt like I was moving in the wrong direction. Back at the farm, my neighbor's dog came trotting over to investigate when I pulled in the driveway, which is about as warm a welcome as rural Manitoba offers in December. The house was cold. I put on water for coffee, walked through the rooms, and noticed the silence in a way I hadn't in a long time. Stephanie called that evening. She asked how it went. I told her it went well. She asked if I was going to be honest with her. I told her the truth, that everything I'd seen and experienced had only made me more sure, not less. That the person I'd met was exactly who I'd spent 9 months talking to. That I wasn't sure yet what came next, but I knew what I wasn't going to do, which was pretend the whole thing hadn't happened. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to believe you." I told her that was a start. The question of what came next kept me up for several months. The obvious assumption that Glenda would eventually immigrate to Canada had seemed logical before I'd actually been to Cebu. After spending that time there, it seemed less simple. She had a career she'd built over 20 years. She had her mother, Lourdes, who was in her late 70s and not in excellent health. She had her sister, who was just starting her professional life. She had a neighborhood where people greeted her by name, a hospital where she was trusted and respected, a community she'd been part of her entire life. She'd never once described any of it as something she was trying to leave. When we talked about the future, she talked about building something, not escaping to somewhere else. I went back to Cebu in the spring, then again in the fall. Each time I left, the return to Manitoba felt a little more like going to a place I was from rather than a place I lived. The decision came slowly, then quickly, the way these things usually do. I'm not a young man, and I don't pretend to be. At 63, with a farm I could lease out to a neighbor, a modest RRSP I'd been building for 30 years, and CPP that would start flowing within the year, I had more flexibility than I'd ever given myself credit for. The math wasn't comfortable. It wasn't impossible either. I sat down with Glenda during my third visit, and we went through everything together, actual spreadsheets, because she's methodical, which I respect. We looked at living costs in Mandaue versus living costs in Manitoba. We looked at what private health insurance in the Philippines would run and what it covered. We worked out how I'd spend summers back in Canada. Because I wasn't prepared to give that up entirely, and because Stephanie deserved to have her father within a reasonable distance at least part of the year. We came up with something workable. Not perfect, workable. I called Stephanie from Cebu that evening and told her what we'd decided. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "When?" The first months were not what people imagine when they hear about someone retiring to a tropical island. There was no beach chair and no umbrella drink. There was a 12-page lease agreement I couldn't fully read without help, a bank account that took 3 visits to open, a barangay registration process that nobody seemed able to explain consistently, and a mobile phone plan I overpaid for by a significant amount before Glenda's sister set me straight. I also made a fool of myself repeatedly. I once spent 10 minutes arguing, politely, about the price of something at a market before Glenda quietly told me the vendor was charging me the correct price and I had misread the sign. I tipped in situations where tipping wasn't customary and didn't tip in the one situation where it apparently was. I once greeted Glenda's Aunt Perla with the wrong word. I'd been practicing my Cebuano, which I want to be clear is much harder than it sounds, and spent the next 4 minutes being corrected by 4 different people simultaneously. Glenda never once made me feel embarrassed about any of it. She always waited until we were alone, then explained what had happened and why, in the same calm, informative way she'd answered my question about Cebu neighborhoods 3 years earlier. Little by little, things became familiar. The carinderia near the hospital became my regular breakfast spot. The sari-sari store on the corner started stocking a particular kind of instant coffee I'd mentioned liking. The security guard at Glenda's building learned my name and waved me through without checking my ID. I stopped feeling like a guest. Then, about 8 months after I'd made the full move, Glenda's mother had a small stroke. It wasn't severe. Lourdes recovered well. But for 3 days she was in the ICU at the hospital where Glenda worked, which meant Glenda was simultaneously a family member in crisis and a nurse who knew every person on the ward professionally. She held it together in a way I still find remarkable. I, on the other hand, was less useful than I would have liked. The family gathered. Glenda has an enormous family in the way that many Filipino families are enormous: aunts, cousins. The neighbors who have been around so long they've become honorary aunts, children whose exact relationship to the wider family I never quite untangled. They filled the waiting area. They brought food. They prayed together. They talked constantly in Cebuano, and I sat among them understanding almost nothing. I felt, in that waiting room, more like an outsider than I had in all the months that had come before. Not because anyone made me feel unwelcome. They didn't. Not for a single moment. It was simply the reality of being in a room full of people united by language and history and grief, and being the one person who didn't fully belong to any of those things. At one point, Glenda came out of the ward on a short break. She found me in a corner chair, pretending to read something on my phone. She sat down beside me. She didn't ask if I was okay or tell me everything was fine. She just sat there, her shoulder against mine, for about 5 minutes. Then she squeezed my hand and went back in. I thought about those 5 minutes for a long time afterward. She hadn't had to come find me. She was managing her own fear and her own exhaustion and her professional responsibilities all at once. But she found me anyway. Lourdes came home 11 days later. She spent 3 weeks fussing over all of us in the way that only a recovering woman in her late 70s truly can. And by the end of it, she'd taught me to make a passable arroz caldo, which she announced was the least she could do. Stephanie came to visit in the fall of the second year. She came alone. Her husband couldn't get the time off, and she stayed for 9 days. I didn't ask her to come with an open mind. I didn't brief her on what to say or how to act. I just picked her up from the airport and let her see it. She and Glenda were careful with each other for the first 2 days. Polite in that particular Canadian way where everything is pleasant and nothing is quite said. I watched from a comfortable distance and didn't push. By day 4, they'd gone to the carbon market together without me. I'd pretended I had something to sort out at the house. When they came back, they were carrying bags and laughing about something Stephanie hadn't quite been able to explain to a vendor, and Glenda had stepped in to translate at exactly the right moment. On the second last evening, Stephanie and I sat outside while Glenda was cooking. My daughter looked out at the lights of the city for a while without saying anything. Then she said, "She's not what I was picturing." I waited. "I was picturing someone I'd have to protect you from," she said. "That's not what she is." I told her I knew. She looked over at me. "You laugh more than you used to." It was the most her mother's daughter had ever sounded. I still spend my summers back in Manitoba. 3 months, usually, long enough to visit Stephanie and her husband, to see the farm, to sit in my truck on a gravel road and watch the light change over a field of canola and remember why I loved that place for 40 years. I'm not leaving it behind. I'm just not living there anymore. Someone asked me not long ago whether I ever regretted it, whether I thought about what my life would have looked like if I'd listened to every warning and stayed on the farm and let the whole thing quietly go. Honestly, I do think about it sometimes, mostly late at night when I'm being too hard on myself, the way men in their 60s tend to be. But I know exactly what that version of my life would have looked like. I'd already been living it. It was comfortable. It was familiar. And it was getting smaller every year, the way grief makes things smaller if you let it. People can only judge a relationship from the outside. They see the age difference, the distance, the statistics. What they can't see is a woman sitting beside you in a waiting room when she has every reason not to bother. What they can't see is a security guard who finally stops checking your ID because you've become part of the neighborhood. What they can't see is your daughter coming back from a market laughing, carrying more than she expected, already telling a story she'll repeat for years. I look across the room at Glenda sometimes when she doesn't know I'm watching, reading, or talking on the phone with Lourdes, or quietly going about whatever the evening requires. And I think about the Tuesday night in February when I almost didn't answer a stranger's reply on the internet. Stephanie calls every Sunday now. At the end of every call, without fail, she says, "Tell Glenda I said hi." It took a while to get there, but it's the part I think about most.